I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my chiefly co-host, Brett.
Alice, you know, your descriptors never actually described me, but I got to say, today I'm a little tongue-tied because it is very unusual that we get to ask questions of a judge, and I really don't know how to handle this.
This almost never happens to us, and we are not the ones in trouble for once, but you all are in for an incredible treat. You don't want to hear us talk. You want to hear two of our most distinguished guests to have graced the legal briefs, and they are former Chief Judge Belvin Perry Jr. and also Amy Mitchell. Now, you're going to know their names because Chief Judge Perry, he's known for an incredibly storied career that we're going to get to hear about sometime today. You may know his name from presiding over the Casey Anthony trial, and he has graced us all with his storytelling by putting a lot of the capital murder cases and the memoir of his incredible career into a new book called The Velvet Hammer, which he has co-authored with attorney Amy Mitchell. And both Amy and Chief Judge Perry are here with us today. Thank you both so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Absolutely. There's so much to dive into, but because we have, two incredible people to talk to here. First of all, let's start with you, Judge Perry. Can you give us a quick background? People see these very famous televised trials, and they just see a judge in a black robe, and they don't know the incredible work it takes to get to where you are. So can you give people a little bit of a background of how you became who you are today and what you're doing today?
Okay, it started back being raised in Orlando, Florida, during the dark days of segregation. My father was one of the first two Black police officers for the Orlando Police Department. He started January 3rd, 1951. I grew up in Orlando. I went to undergraduate school at Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University. Hung around and got a master's degree in student personnel services. Came out and worked for a semester and a half, and then I enrolled in the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University. Left there, came back to Orlando after I finished the Texas bar. I'm a member of the Texas and Florida bar, and I started my legal career December 1st. 1977 as an assistant state attorney. I worked my way up the ranks in the state attorney's office, became chief assistant state attorney. And during that time, I prosecuted some of the most infamous murder cases in the history of Orange County. I had in excess of more than 100 jury trials. I tried to get appointed to the bench 7 times. Was never able to make it out of that process because I irritated a former president of the Orange County Bar Association, who was a legal heavyweight. It had to do with a case called the State of Florida versus Kirk Hansborough. And finally, my boss, Mr. Robert Egan, the state attorney, said, look, you would never get appointed because the cases I prosecuted, we didn't plea bargain. And he said, the only way you're going to become a judge is to run. I ran against an incumbent judge in '88, and I was blessed to win in a 2-county race in the Ninth Circuit. Was in the felony division for the first 4 years of my career on the bench. And then one day sitting around, I ended up becoming the chief judge, and I was the chief judge for a total of 18 years until my retirement. That's a thumbnail sketch of my career.
So tell me this, somebody with your distinguished background, you could have done a lot of things. What was it about being a judge that attracted you? And what were some of the lessons that you took from practicing law to the bench?
Well, it started back when I was about 7 or 8 years of age. My daddy was a police officer, and I started to go to court with him when he had to testify in the old city court at that time. And I was sort of mesmerized by that, coupled with watching Perry Mason. And I said, one day I would like to be a judge. And that stuck with me. There were two things that I really enjoyed in elementary, junior high, and high school was history and science. And I wanted to either be a doctor or a lawyer. Then there was a thing in 12th grade called organic chemistry that opened my eyes to let me know that medicine was not the road for me to take.
This is the tie that binds all lawyers together.
It's so true. Thank goodness for organic chemistry to push some of us into the law.
And, growing up in a law enforcement home, I got a chance to see a lot of things and experience things. And I developed a taste for the law. Oddly enough, when I finished law school, I had a fond dislike for criminal law. I loved torts and taxation. But when I graduated from law school, came back home, all those particular doors were closed. And I ended up in the office of the state attorney, and the rest is sort of history.
So, Amy, I want to ask you a question, too, while we're on this, because we're all lawyers here, and law has taken us all in different directions. How did you end up being someone who wanted to write books, and how did you connect with Judge Perry?
So my writing career started basically since I could put pencil to paper. I don't know. I was born with this ability to write. My whole dream was to always become a published author. I read books as a child and wrote books forever. And I tried to get books published and wrote, just kept writing. And I watched the Casey Anthony trial on television. I was a stay-at-home mom at the time. I still had my law degree. But when I watched that trial, I was pregnant with my second daughter, and it really resonated with me. And it was an emotional trial. And I saw Judge Perry on the TV, and just the way he navigated the courtroom, the velvet hammer. He had this smooth level of ease, but never shrank away from coming down hard with a hammer. He commanded respect. He was no nonsense. And I just admired him. And I used to say, I'm going to write his book. And he didn't know it yet, but I knew it. I didn't know when. I didn't know how I was going to get in touch with him, but I just knew it was going to happen. And fast forward 5 years from the verdict, I opened up the law department at a local high school, private high school where my children attended. And I taught law to high school students in elective. And I thought to myself, I would love to have Judge Perry come and lecture. It just was a random thought that popped into my head. So I looked him up, and I found out he retired from the bench, and he was working at a personal injury law firm. So I just clicked on the number, and I wasn't expecting to hear his voice, but he answered. And I introduced myself, told him what I was doing, told him why I looked him up. And I said, Judge, you've inspired me in my life to want to become a judge. And I think that you could inspire these high school students who are going somewhere. And I asked him if he would lecture, and he shockingly and humbly said, yes, he would. I didn't expect him to show up really, but he did. And when he showed up, he had about over 100 high school students sitting at the edge of their seat during his lecture. And it wasn't really a lecture. It was just fascinating about his true crime stories, how he became a judge. And anyone knows high school students, it's hard to grip their attention for more than half an hour. And when I saw how captivated the room was, including myself, I was like, how does he not have a book out? I said, Judge, do you have a book out? He said, no. And I said, can I write your book? He hesitated, but we're here now. So
Amy, wow, thank you so much for sharing that. There's so many aspects of your career that I think could be its own podcast. Thank you for being, so forthright about stepping out of the traditional practicing of law, and then clearly that you were able to transition back with what you were passionate about. And I think the biggest thing there was just reaching out to Judge Perry. You wanted to talk to him, so you did. And then you wanted to write a book, and you did. And that's a lot of credit, of course, also to Judge Perry for being open to these. And I've had a chance to look at this book. It is a gripping read. For any of you out there listening right now, there's much more of this interview you're going to want to listen to, but you can get this book already. It's already out, wherever you get books. I like bookstores, Barnes & Noble or Amazon. But what's so fascinating about this storytelling is, like you said, these are all true stories. They're lived experiences, but with the background of a lawyer writing them, you're able to bring the accuracy of what's happening kind of behind the lens. America sees what's on TV, they see the flash, but there's so much intricacy, and explaining why things happen legally, I think is very important for understanding why these cases grip the nation's attention. So Amy, thank you for sharing that. We're going to talk, of course, about Casey Anthony, Judge Perry, but before we get there, a lot of people know your name because of you presiding over Casey Anthony. But other than that case, what's kind of the most significant case you've heard as a judge? And how did you and Amy decide what stories to include in the book, The Velvet Hammer?
As chief judge of my circuit, I inherited most of the death cases for one reason or another. And they were the most heinous murders in the history of the Ninth Circuit. And, we highlighted, I think, in the book about 10 cases. But there were numerous other cases also involving, some civil cases. But all of the cases in my mind were significant long before Casey Anthony, because you had victims, either survivor victims. You had the rule of law that to make sure that a person received a fair trial and was enabled to exercise their constitutional right to a trial. Most people say, well, a person is guilty of sin. Why are they going to trial? Well, that's their right. That's what separates this great nation from other nations. A little thing called the presumption of innocence. So there were numerous cases, like case I prosecuted, the Black Widow, a homicide case that I presided over, the Scott Mansfield case in Osceola County, one of the most brutal murders that ever occurred in Osceola County, from a person who was very sadistic, mean-spirited, and basically not only did he murder this lady, he mutilated her body while she was still alive for his own version of sick gratification. So that was my career. I did the worst of the worst, and I did cases that absolutely really made no sense. I would never forget an off-duty police officer who happened to go to the ATM at about 2 o'clock in the morning, ended up a victim of an attempted robbery, got shot and died. One defendant was 17, the other one was 16. And that case stands out because the non-shooter was given an opportunity to enter a plea to second-degree murder and testify against his co-defendant for a cap of 25 years. Halfway through the plea, he stopped and said, he can't do it. I can't be a snitch. And, I let his mom talk to him, and his lawyer tried to convince him to take the deal. Tragically, he went to trial. He was promptly convicted, and he's in prison now with a life sentence, and he will never get out. Even after he was convicted, the state came back and say, look, if you testify against your co-defendant, we will let you plead to second-degree murder with a cap of 20 years. And he said, I can't be a snitch. And it brought this thing out what has happened to our young people, that they feel this bond that they would throw away their lives, their life rather, for this thing not being a snitch. When there were days back in the day when people would sing like the Temptations, and you had to go buy extra tapes because they would talk. So that to me was one of the most perplexing cases. And his co-defendant, who was the shooter, got convicted. And when they came before me for sentencing, the way they were yucking it up in the jury box prior to sentencing, you thought that they had been named co-MVPs of the Super Bowl. And, I imposed life sentences, and they will never see the light of day again as a free individual. My career as a judge and a prosecutor, I spent a lot of my time trying the worst of the worst.
The question that I'm sure gets asked a lot, and this is for both Judge Perry and Amy, is seeing the worst of the worst, whether prosecuting them or having to preside over their cases and hand down these incredibly, life-altering sentences that the law requires. How do you keep your perspective of when you see the worst of humanity? How do you keep your perspective? Because you clearly are an attorney and a judge who maintains compassion and a measure of hope. That's why it's, you do things like talk to high school students and you write books, because I do think that storytelling is an incredibly powerful way to affect change of the worst that we see. So how do you deal with all that trauma and the devastation that you see and maintain who you are and maintain the ability to keep doing what you do day in and day out?
As I stated earlier, I was raised in a law enforcement home. And one of the things my parents taught me, and one of the lessons that you learn growing up in segregation, is you learn to put things in compartments. You don't let them bleed over into your life. You take it, you set it aside. What gave me hope? People often talk about the people that I sentenced to death or gave long prison sentences, but they don't often talk about those individuals that you gave a break to or that you gave them a short time in prison. And through the years, I've had people come up to me and say, you may not remember me, which I don't most of the time. You gave me a break, and I haven't been in trouble since then. I never forget about maybe a year ago, this guy came up to me and said, the prosecutor wanted me to go to prison for 5 years. You saw something in me that I really didn't see in myself. And you sort of laid out a scenario as to what should I do with my life? Did I want to serve a life sentence on an installment plan and not have the opportunity to watch my children grow up? Did I ever want to take the chance of not being around my mom that, I love dearly? You laid all that out to me, and you gave me probation, and it made me think. I never forget driving up about 5 years ago to a Popeye's Fried Chicken in a suburban city to Orlando. And I was paying for my food, and the lady came up with the person who was handing me the food and said, I'm the manager. I said, it's nice to meet you. Say, you don't remember me, Judge Perry, but I was before you. And, you gave me some time in the Orange County jail, and you asked me to reflect on my life, and I did. I'm not in trouble. I worked my way up to be the manager of this Popeye. So with the bad comes the good. And, one of the things you learn in life is that there are good people, that there are bad people, that there's a certain percentage of people that can be redeemed, and there's a certain small percentage of people that are so evil, so diabolical, that there's nothing you can do but warehouse them for the sake of society. And I think, Amy and I discussed these cases, and she did a good job of taking situations and making them flow in a way that was an easy read and encompass, some of my background and some of my upbringing to reflect that, we live in an imperfect world. We strive for perfection, but prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys all have a duty, and it sometimes can become messy, but it's the rule of law that separates us from just about every nation on this earth.
Amy, I had a question for you, and the judge sort of touched on it. When you're writing for yourself, it's one thing. When you're writing for someone else, trying to capture someone's voice, it's another thing. How did you approach that? And tell us about the pressure you felt about getting Judge Perry's story right and delivering it to the public.
I don't think Judge Perry knows this, but I felt immense pressure because I had taken on this task that was a dream, really, that, I didn't think would actually happen. And it was happening. And I was determined, 100% determined. And he can attest to this. I mean, I made sure he kept appointments. I was like the judge. I made sure he kept appointments. If he canceled, I rescheduled him. I made sure that I followed up with him. I called him. He was so humble. I just have to reiterate that. Even though he was so busy, he made himself available. He never disappointed me in terms of, he might postpone some appointments, but he always made it. And I think what it was is my passion for his story really captured his voice. I just really believed in it. I believed in what I was writing for him. I think I was put on this earth to write this book for him. I don't know how else to put it because it's like my calling. And he would tell the story. I would handwrite it at first on a notepad. He would come to the country club where I lived once a month a few years back. And we would sit at the clubhouse on the veranda and he would just talk and we would record it. I started recording it at first. And that was more of his memoir, his growing up. And I would re-listen to those recordings and really capture his voice and capture what he was saying. And once my fingers started typing, I just couldn't stop. So yeah, it was something that I knew I had to carry through till the end, but he told his story very like he's speaking right now.
Well, this kind of brings us to the case that I know that so many people have questions about, which is Casey Anthony. And it'll be so interesting to hear the perspectives of the two of you working on this book together, but obviously Judge Perry with you presiding over it. And Amy, as you said, you watched in real time and then had to relive it in terms of writing it. Judge Perry, how did it come to be that the Casey Anthony case was going to be in your courtroom? Was this a random assignment or was it your assignment because you were chief judge? Kind of talk us through, did you know it was going to be as big of a case as it was when it first landed on your, I'm sure, very full docket?
Well, when the Anthony case first came about, the case was assigned to Judge Stan Strickland, who was an excellent judge. And he was on the criminal bench. And as the case would wind through the necessary processes, he was about to be reassigned to civil. I had talked to him about maintaining the case. And we had made arrangements for him to continue the case when he transferred to civil. I was a part of the lobbying team for the Trial Court Budget Commission, which meant that every time the Florida legislature was in session, either for hearing weeks or actual session, I was in Tallahassee. So I had spent a full day up there watching the sausage being made. And I was driving back to my hotel and my cell phone rang. And it was the administrative judge, Judge Reginald Whitehead of the Criminal Division. I need to talk with you. I said, okay. He said, the defense filed today a motion to have Judge Strickland recused because of a comment he made about a blogger that was blogging about the case, that he just, for whatever reason, made the comment he thought the blogger was fair and balanced. I said, do you have a copy of the motion? He says, yes, I've reviewed it. I said, why don't you email me the motion? Let me get back to my hotel, fire up my laptop, and let me read it, and I'll call you and we'll discuss it. I say, give me about a half hour to 45 minutes. So I called Reggie, and I say, I've reviewed it. And I said, do you know what Stan is going to do? No, I don't know what he's going to do. I said, well, let's discuss the merits of the motion. I said, in my opinion, based upon the four corners of the motion, he's going to have to grant it. And Reggie agreed. And I said, well, we'll know tomorrow what he's going to do, or sometime this week what he's going to do. And I said, well, what is your plan for reassignment of this case? And he said, well, we need someone, number one, that has the time. As you know, the lawyers are a handful in that case. We need someone that's going to maintain control of the courtroom. And we need someone that's going to push this case to the point where it can be tried or pled. And I say, well, who is the unfortunate individual that you're going to assign this case to? And he said, well, I have someone in mind. And I said, who? He said, you. And he said, you're the chief judge. You can overrule me. I said, well, I've never stopped the administrative judges. They always reassign cases upon recusal. And I'm not going to interfere now. So subsequently, Judge Strickland granted the motion, and I ended up getting assigned the case. And certainly, I knew it was a high-profile case for Orange County. I knew it had garnered a lot of national attention. Never in my wildest imagination that I knew this case would be what it ended up being. It was all-consuming, and it had all the ingredients that would draw people to a particular case. You had a lovely young girl that disappeared. Nobody knew where she was. You had grandparents who were a little different, but they loved the child and they were making national pleas. And you had the mother, who was a very complex young lady who was dubbed a party girl. You had the fact that there were rumors, which some of them came true, that she had become involved with a deputy who had nothing to do with the case. So you had all the ingredients of a daytime soap opera that kept people wanting to come back for more each day.
So as the director of that soap opera, how did you handle the case? Did you treat it differently than any other case, or did you try and just say, this is going to be just like any other murder case in my courtroom?
You know, fortunately, I've handled a lot of high-profile cases, and I treated this case like I did every other case, particular homicides. I had right out the bat a case management conference and set deadline, and I made sure that we had intervening case management conference to make sure the deadlines would be complied with and followed. I always arranged to have hearing time, and I managed the case. It was a very complex case in the sense that I knew, one, there was going to be novel scientific evidence. Two, 9 times out of 10, they were going to request a change of venue, and trying to find a location that you're supposed to, with a change of venue, find a circuit that is demographically similar to the circuit that the case was in. I knew that because of the volume of evidence and the number of witnesses, that it would be cost prohibitive to move the trial, move all those witnesses and have them shuffle back and forth, because I had done that as a prosecutor. So I knew that we had to go somewhere, select a jury, and return the jury there. And all the mechanics of dealing with jurors away from home for 6 to 8 weeks. It was a great deal of planning, a great deal of dealing with the media. One of the smartest things that I did, it wasn't my idea, it was one of our court administrator's idea, create a media committee and let them take a stab at drafting the rules on how they should conduct themselves. And I would have to put my stamp of approval on it. Even though within 4 or 5 days after the actual trial had started back in Orlando, the media found out the location of where the jurors were staying. They were so terrified of me for whatever reason, they never did air it. They were afraid that I would throw them out of the courtroom. It was a lot of moving pieces. And yes, that case took on a life of its own. And behind the scenes, there was hours upon hours of preparation.
And you've touched upon this, and we're seeing it more and more every day. But part of the complexity of the case was not only the actual substance of the case and the nation being gripped by the facts of the case, but as you said, the media, which is its own circus. And it's great that this media seemed to respect the robe and act in a manner that we expect journalists to act in. But as we've seen in lots of coverage of true crime nowadays, there are a lot of voices because journalism is no longer relegated to the traditional networks. Anyone with a microphone and a YouTube page can now call themselves reporters. There was a lot of talk throughout the Casey Anthony trial on media. How did you separate that from what you had to do day in and day out, what the rule of law required, and to keep the pressures from the media separate from how you ran the case? Because we're all human. Of course, we hear the criticism, we hear other people's opinions, which they know much less than you do as the sitting judge. But how did you keep those things separate and keep your head cool, keep justice in mind, and keep the media in their place?
Well, first of all, I did not watch the news, read the newspaper, or anything with that case. But you hit on something that is very important. What is the media? Who is the media? At that time, you had bloggers. And if you looked at the Supreme Court rules dealing with cameras in the courtroom and the media, there was no definition of the media. So we scoured and we found a definition that NASA was using. You know, if you were a blogger, you had to have a certain audience. You just couldn't say I was a blogger and you got media credentials because, you know, you had about 100 seats in that courtroom. And, you know, we laid out every seat for the media and we were able to take care of most of the folks. We turned the judicial conference room in, which was a large room on that floor, into a place where the media could sit, those who weren't in the courtroom, in a more relaxed but at a closed circuit so they could watch, drink their coffee, and do what they needed to do. So we had to define who the media was. And then they policed themselves as to the rules. And it worked well. The only thing that did not work well until the county listened to us was determining who got into the courtroom, you know, general audience. People would line up at 5 o'clock in the morning. There were fist fights. And finally they listened and we had a lottery system where the day before you could come, put your name in, and you would know by 4 o'clock whether or not you were gonna be there. We had a backup list, so if you didn't show up by a certain time, somebody else took your spot. It was a very complex thing that people don't understand how we got where we got. Dealing with jurors, one of the most fascinating things was when we looked at cases, high-profile cases, where the jury was sequestered, they lost a juror about once a week. And I was terrified when we could only get 5 alternates. We didn't lose a juror. We put together like a summer camp list of what you needed to bring, things you needed to do at home. We even arranged for a post office box so that they can transfer temporarily and their bills would come. We put them at a resort, the Rosen Shingle Creek, which is a 4-star resort. The owner, who I knew, was very helpful. He gave us the state rate. We learned that we could program their television so that they only got the channels that did not do news. We had a day room for them. We had an approved reading list of books that both sides agreed on. We had a DVD library where they could check out movies. In their, quote, day room, which was a hospitality suite, they could come in, they could talk on their phones under the supervision of court deputies. They could go on the internet to check their email. And one of the things I think that helped a great deal was, we worked a half a day on Saturday. That was to keep them from having too much time to get into mischief. Starting at 3:00 on Saturdays, they could have visitors not in a common area, but in their rooms. And of course, the person had to be screened and they had to sign agreements not to discuss the case with them. And at midnight, their visitors had to be out of their room. So, they could have their significant other or family or whatever have some private time. We made it so that court administration would take their orders for, grocery shopping, snacks, and whatever beverages they would care to enjoy in the evening. We had confidentiality agreements signed by the housekeeping staff, and we had the same housekeepers for their rooms. We also did not let housekeeping take their trash. You can learn a lot of things about people through their trash. So the court deputies took their trash and it was taken away and disposed of. We took them to different places for lunch and dinner. We had made arrangements for medical teams to be available if somebody had medical issues. We had the availability of barbers and hairdressers so that people could take care of their grooming needs. It was a well thought out plan to make sure that they did not feel like prisoners. So we didn't lose a juror, which was surprising. So to make a case go, there was a great deal of planning for every detail. The exercise room at the hotel, it was shut down between 5 and 7 a.m. solely for the use of jurors, and the televisions were disabled. The resort had 3 swimming pools. There was a certain time that one of the smaller pools were reserved just for jurors.
It's an incredible amount of thought that had to go into
but
that.
It's such good insight for people who complain about things like, oh, why isn't every trial televised? I mean, just the amount of planning. We called you earlier the director of the soap opera. I think the more apt title was you were the mayor of a town. I mean, every single thing, those of us who have to parent small children, you had to parent full grown adults who have way more opinions and agency. And of course, you did all of this with an eye towards making sure the jury stayed unbiased and listened to just the testimony presented in court, which is why you took all these steps. I mean, with all of that, were you surprised by the verdict at the end of a very long, dramatic trial in Casey Anthony?
The state had a very compelling case, number one. And yes, I was surprised. But being a trial judge and a prosecutor, I always knew that anything was possible. I thought that possibility was remote. But yes, like most of America, I was surprised.
So one of the main questions we get, and when we covered Casey Anthony, the question we got a lot was, what would we have done differently to win the case? Do you think, was there a turning point in that case? And was there anything the prosecution could have done so that this case turned out differently than it did?
Well, there were a couple of things, and whether or not they would have made a difference, your guess is as good as mine. And I'm going to use a football analogy. Great coaches go into a game with a game plan, but they also make adjustments to deal with what they actually find rather than what they think they're going to find. The defense did a better job of adjusting to the 12 people in the box and appealing to them than the prosecution. And I've used this analogy before. You got two cars and you got two used car salesmen trying to sell you a car. Both cars have similar blemishes. You know, they have their lumps, their bumps, their peeling paint. And you're trying to decide who you're going to buy the car from. Are you going to buy the car from the person that is friendly, charming, respectful, that attempts to create an atmosphere that you can trust me? Or are you going to buy the car from someone when they objects, they're very volatile, you can see their anger, you can see their body language, you can see them smirking? I think that may have played a role. One of the things that surprised me, this was a classic dry bones case where you didn't know what the cause of death was. Most cases are won and lost, particularly in the civil case, but also in the criminal case in jury selection. Of course, they spend a great deal of time. We all spend a great deal of time dealing with pretrial publicity and weeding those folks out that had firm opinions. And of course, you spend time on death qualifying the jury. Oddly enough, there were no questions asked about the fact that we can't prove how she died. We know she's dead. And, you know, if you receive an instruction that that's not an element to be proven, would you have any problems following that instruction? As you know, the judge's job is to give the standard jury instructions, which are promulgated by the Florida Supreme Court. It is incumbent upon the defense or the prosecution, if there is a specialized instruction dealing with a point of law during the charge conference, to raise that and present that instruction in writing. I just knew that the prosecution would be asking for that special instruction, that they did not need to prove how she died. That's not an element of the crime. And as you know, the lawyers in that case, and most lawyers, particularly lawyers in that case, they can't even agree on the time of day. So I researched it. I had drafted instruction because I didn't want to waste a lot of time in the back and forth with them arguing. I had the instruction that I needed, and the state never asked for it. And lo and behold, one of the jurors, the only one that talked afterwards, said her rationale for finding the defendant not guilty was because the state could not prove how she died. Another thing was, when you have an overwhelming circumstantial evidence case, you become overconfident. And you go for what, when you're in law school, we used to call those examinations at the end of the semester, one shot Charlie. You get one shot at it. It was interesting that the state, in their closing summation, did not spend a lot of time saying, if you do not believe that we've proven the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, this is why we've proved the lesser included offense, second degree murder, the charge of aggravated manslaughter, and go through those and show them the evidence that support those things. They didn't do that. You also knew that there were going to be questions about George Anthony's credibility. The young lady that testified and said that, you know, George told her this story about the baby drowning, and that she had an affair with George. Well, George got up there and said none of that happened. But you knew that George had baggage, and you knew that the defense was going to point and throw every conceivable thing and implicate George in any way that they could. They produced records that George was at work, but they didn't spend a lot of time explaining those records. What better way to do that than, you know, I don't know whether or not it was available, but have somebody who was at his job come explain how they knew he was there. If you could put George at work and not George coming back fishing that child out of the water, which was a stretch, those were things that they could have shored up. Every good prosecutor, in my estimation, and what I used to do was I looked at my case and I looked at it from the standpoint of the defense as to what are the weaknesses to my case. And you take those steps to shore those points up. You don't let them bring the weaknesses out. You shore them up and bring them out yourself and show why that is not possible. So when you look at all of that, and hindsight is always 2020, sometimes having a strong case and sometimes being overconfident can be a prosecutor's worst enemy. I know as a prosecutor, I was always nervous when I had a case with a confession and one or two eyewitnesses, and the police stopped investigating and getting additional evidence. So that's the long and short of it.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that because we see that again and again and again in the cases that we cover, that some of the cases that end up being the most controversial years later are cases that seemed like slam dunks at the time of the trial. Because at trial, everybody thought, we got this. No reason, like you said, to run down some of those leads. It would turn out to be nothing. And then they end up being loose ends. And years later, they become problems for the prosecutor. Let me ask you this. Casey Anthony is often cited to us as well as an example of what's wrong with the jury system and a reason the jury system is flawed. You've seen a lot of cases. You've seen a lot of juries. What are your thoughts about the jury system?
I think the jury system is the best system that we have. At times, it can be imperfect when we look through our own lens. And unless you can show that there were some tampering or some shenanigans, just because we don't agree with the outcome, it is far better than the system that we left England for, where the king would pick the jurors. So most jurors are very conscientious, and they often view things differently than the participants in a case. Because, you know, whether you're with the prosecution or the defense, you have your own built-in biases. And you're dealing with people who are asked to come in. They have no idea as to what the law is. You read it to them, you give them a copy of it, and you ask them to do the best they can. And so I've always been a supporter of the jury system, and nobody's been able to show me something that's better than that. I will always be a protector of that particular system.
And thank goodness for that. Thank you for your service and for both you and Amy putting these incredible stories into a book. We've already reached an hour, and I want to be respectful of your time, but there are clearly so many more hours of stories that we would just be sitting on the edge of our seats like those high school students of Amy's wanting to listen to. But we get to through your book, The Velvet Hammer. Kind of as a wrap up, you know, we've gotten to hear in detail about one case, but you discuss many other cases in this book. Amy and Judge Perry, what do you hope people take away from this book, and what do you hope to accomplish with The Velvet Hammer? I'll start with you, Amy.
I think Amy is the best person to answer that question.
I hope that people would understand that evil does exist in this world. And you might read this book as a proponent of the death penalty or not a proponent of it, or just maybe didn't give it much thought. But I hope the book educates readers out there about how the death penalty can work. And I think Judge Perry does a really excellent job in detailing. He does not push it. He says actually in one part that everybody's entitled to their opinion and there are pros and cons to both. So I just think it's a very in-depth look at how judges arrive at the decision to sentence death or not death, the jury system, the aggravating factors, the mitigating factors in the criminal statute. I think that I think the takeaway from that is also how judges have this power to decide life or death, and how they are human beings, as well as Judge Perry has said, and it's not an easy task to do what they do. So that's generally what I think.
Thank you,
Judge?
Amy. Yes, Judge Perry, is there anything you'd like to add about these incredible stories. I think it's more than just stories. I think these are incredible lessons for the next generation of people who will be taking over our justice system. What do you hope they take away from your experience and this book?
The one thing I want people to take away from this is a glimpse inside of the world that we live in. That there are those among us that can be very cruel, diabolical, and become monsters that can take a life without even thinking about it. You know, it's one thing to take a life. That's bad. That's horrible. But the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. Not for any ordinary premeditated murder, but for the worst of the worst. And when you look at those cases, you can see how those folks that I did sentence to die tortured people, not a quick, swift death, but a death filled with pain and suffering. Imagine someone being strangled to death while they watch their lives slip away. Imagine being stabbed 21 times. Imagine having parts of your anatomy while you are still alive being cut off. The pain, the impending doom. And we tend to forget about the victim and the victim's family. That person's life goes on, but there are times where the ultimate penalty must be imposed. And, you know, people will say they need to do away with the death penalty, but you need to think about this. If people didn't kill people in those unduly torturous situations where it looks like they're getting some type of pleasure out of it, there would be no need for the death penalty. People do not these days want to take personal responsibility and be accountable for their own actions. Whether you agree or disagree with the death penalty, we all should value the sanctity of life. That was a human being that died, that left loved ones and friends that will forever ache for the rest of their lives on this earth because of somebody's acts. And murder is a very unpleasant business. It's not pretty. It's not nice. And the effects on those who are left behind, the victim's family, is a lifetime of torment and suffering and grief.
Judge Perry, such incredibly powerful words straight from the trenches. Thank you for this wisdom. And thank you, Amy, for helping put all this wisdom in book form. Velvet Hammer is out now. You guys will want to read this. You've gotten just a taste of what you're going to get from that book. We are so honored to have been able to take this hour and chat with you, Judge Perry and Amy. Thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for your lifetime of service, Judge. And we can't wait to see how your book changes lives. I don't say that lightly. I think this amount of experience is going to be earth-changing. So thank you, both of you. And we will respect your time. We will sign off despite me wanting to ask so many more questions. But grab that book. Brett, do you have any last thoughts before we let the wonderful Judge and Amy off of our podcast?
I just want to thank you both for coming on, and I want to thank you both for taking the time to write the book and put it in front of the public, and for speaking up for victims, because I think that's so important. You're right. There's not enough talk about victims and what justice really means. And when we talk about the prison system, we talk about rehabilitation a lot, and you spoke about that. There are people who can be rehabilitated, and we are thankful whenever that happens. But there are some people, as you said, who have gone so far and have done things that are so horrendous that protecting the public and punishing them and getting justice for victims is the only thing you can do. And I really appreciate you speaking out for that. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us, and cannot wait for everyone to read your book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Well, you guys go out and get Velvet Hammer today. Tell us what you think. And thank you again for Judge Perry and Amy for joining us today. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Perfect. I just wanted to make sure we direct people.
Thrift books, Goodreads. It's actually in the UK. It's on Amazon all over the world. Indigo. It's everywhere.
Okay,
Is there an
perfect.
audio version yet, or is that still in the works?
But I'll sign on. We have like a quick little intro. We'll introduce what we're doing today, and then we'll dive into the conversation if that's okay with you guys.
That's great.
Yes.
All right. Welcome back to the process. Oh no, wrong show. We have two shows.